Welcome to the American Hospital Association's webinar for trustees on CEO succession planning, What to Do. This presentation is brought to you by the AHA Trustee Services. Our presenter today is Bill Westwood. Bill is a senior client partner in Korn Ferry's advisory group, based in the firm's Chicago office. His work primarily focuses on executive assessment, executive coaching, and succession planning. In this session, Bill will lead a discussion of critical strategies for effective CEO succession planning.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, and hello to all of you listening to this and viewing it. What I'd like to spend time today on is how CEO succession planning should work in its best form, some rules of the road that we have established through our practice and work ongoing with clients with respect to this particularly challenging activity for most boards. First, I'd like to point out why it is so critical that you as trustees engage in rigorous succession planning. It is one of the few things that you will do as a board that only you can do. There is no opportunity to outsource it. And in today's healthcare environment, there is particularly challenging opportunities as the environment becomes increasingly hard to predict. Finally, note that because you're focused on a CEO succession effort and opportunity initially, as you engage in that process, it will help you understand your internal talent more, and that investment will also lead to the potential to attract and retain high potential talent over time, which will generate long-term value for the organization as well as a new CEO. But what are some of the roadblocks to CEO succession? And we've listed a number here from our experience, beginning with the lack of process rigor, and this will be where we'll focus a lot of time on in our additional comments today. In particular, the absence of a link between your strategy and the requirements for the next generations of CEOs, and the absence of a standard process for evaluating candidates, as well as a potential bias for internal promotion or external search. We've seen both in our work. Secondly, a lack of alignment. This relates back to some degree to the absence of rigor in process, but it can simply be disagreements over strategic priorities, and it can also be a lack of understanding or clarity around how these priorities translate ultimately to CEO attributes. Finally, there can be debate about how ready internal candidates may be to assume this role and in what time frame. And then there is the factor of human nature. It is often the case that trustees avoid or desire to avoid a horse race by putting this decision off as long as possible because they know there may be two or more viable internal candidates, and that is something to consider. It can be that the board is simply uncomfortable of talking about succession with the incumbent CEO unless that incumbent brings it up. And finally, the CEOs themselves, who are sometimes challenged to think through the succession challenges and planning activities related to their ultimate movement into retirement. So what does the gold standard in CEO succession look like? And we have, as you can see, 7 dimensions to this in our experience that we wanted to share with you. Related, as you might now see, to some of the challenges on the prior page. The first is to get the board aligned around both strategy and what we call a CEO success profile, which is aligned to that strategy. Once that profile has been developed, it will be possible to assess candidates against it as well as against the marketplace to give you a sense of where your internal candidates stand in particular at the outset, and as appropriate external candidates as well. The third aspect of the gold standard is trying to do this in a more long-term context without focusing entirely upon your next choice. That is, particularly with regard to your internal talent pipeline, be thinking about who might be the successor to the initial successor. And that will enable you in the fourth step to challenge potential successors down the road with different types of development experiences so that they are time and challenge tested with regard to how they can be best prepared to compete for the role when and if it becomes available. And by doing so, to the fifth point, you will become more familiar with this leadership bench, as we might call it, and their potential. This is clearly also a responsibility of your incumbent CEO and your head of human resources, but enabling you as a trustee to become more familiar further into the organization with leaders is a critical success factor from our experience. And in order to ensure you pay attention to this question, keeping succession as a standard board agenda item is something that must be a part of your regular meeting protocol. And finally, ensure that as you support and encourage talent management and development planning activities within the organization, that you see the clear linkage between what is being proposed and done and what the organization's strategy looks like. So let's talk about several of these items in a bit more depth, and beginning with aligning the board around strategy. And this is, in our experience, something that must be done in the sense that if you don't have alignment around where you're going, determining who can take you there will become potentially a fractious or very high debate situation. So it will be critical to take the time and the effort to have the open dialogue to ensure that the board is clear on at least the likely direction or the most desirable direction that you want to go. And if there are disagreements on the board about that direction, that they are heard clearly, and at the end of the day, the board agrees upon a particular direction in which the organization will most likely succeed. Because once you have that, it does set the stage for what the attributes of success to enable you to get there will look like, which again we call the CEO success profile. And what is the framework for that profile? It looks like this in our view of the world. That is, it has elements associated with what leaders do, and these in our model are called competencies and experiences, and who they are. And these, again, in our model at the bottom of the slide are called traits and drivers. As you can see, the competencies and experiences are more likely what you will observe and see people doing. The harder to observe traits and drivers are more difficult to discern directly, but over time these are also characteristics of executives and leaders that can become known to you. In our particular case, we have assessment instruments that capture this information in a systematic way. But what's most important is that you organize your thinking in some fashion that allows you to see each leader holistically in terms of what they do and who they are. So once you have that profile defined, the next step for you is to determine who your internal candidates are and to assess them in the context of that profile. So there are different ways in which trustees solicit internal candidate interest in these roles. In general, our view is that the CEO, the incumbent CEO, will have a point of view that should be respected for this purpose. The board may have some additional internal candidates they would like considered, and in our experience, it's always helpful if candidates express an interest that they be given an opportunity to compete for the role. Having said that, the board's task will be to ensure that they have measured carefully how well each of these candidates holds up against that success profile. So you will solicit answers from the candidates to questions related to each of those 4 dimensions and compare those answers with your own firsthand impressions of the candidate and with those of other trustees as well. At the end of the day, in most of our experience, there are 1 to 3 internal candidates who are likely to be capable of becoming a successor. In some cases, there are none. In a handful of cases, there may be more than 3. But in all likelihood, the board will be considering a number somewhere between 1 and 3. And what's equally important, once you have identified and assessed those internal candidates, is to determine on the basis of the time that is available to the succession scenario or succession timing related to the incumbent CEO, what development will be needed for each internal candidate, how to close the gaps that have been identified in the assessment, and as we note, is there time to ensure that at least one internal candidate can be prepared to compete for or to assume the CEO role when the incumbent's tenure is complete? As that process proceeds, it will be important for trustees to hear regularly from the CEO and the head of human resources on the progress being made by internal candidates so that they develop a sense of comfort around how likely an internal candidate will be to become the next CEO. And as they do so, it will then be time for the board to consider whether it will be necessary to take a look at external candidates as well. And as indicated on this slide, it will depend on how confident you are in the internal candidate's progress towards being prepared for this role. It will also depend on whether you believe as trustees there is the likelihood of attracting a stronger external candidate. And finally, are there any challenges, any strategic challenges that you have identified that an external candidate may already have faced that one or more of your internal candidates will not yet have seen in the current organization? Those are the primary considerations from our perspective in terms of whether or not external candidate search is required. Once you have determined what this final candidate pool is, what is critical is that you have a rigorous debate. And again, in our experience, ideally a debate that is largely, if not entirely, fact-based, which is to say there is a profile of success. There are candidates, internal and external, who match or fail to match different aspects of that profile. And the debate then becomes who is the best match for the direction we're going, and why do we know from the evidence we have that that person will be the most likely success in the role. This can be a time-consuming and somewhat contentious process, but because of the importance of the decision, it is crucial that it be an open debate and discussion. As we've noted here, we have encountered situations where a board is deadlocked over two candidates who are very closely matched to the requirements for the role. If that is the case for you, we would suggest that you have each candidate, whether internal or external, prepare and present their vision for the future of your organization, and that you can then compare not only the content of those presentations, the rigor with which they have assembled and presented their point of view, but also the passion or conviction that they have in expressing it, because that will clearly be an element in marshaling support for the direction that they intend to take the organization forward. So then you have made a choice, but guess what? Your job is not yet over. As the incumbent CEO transitions out, he or she and the hospital staff, especially the head of human resources, will have significant roles to play in onboarding a new CEO. From experience, we know that the board must remain directly involved in the process as well if it is to be successful. So don't simply declare success, but stay engaged for at least the first 90 to 100 days. For an internal candidate who is successful, the difference will be primarily in terms of working with and learning about you all. And so what's important there is to be available to the newly appointed internal CEO, to have conversations about board dynamics with them, and to ensure that they are gaining your trust as you gain trust in them, as you get to know them better. These are often one-on-one conversations initially, but certainly would include meetings with the entire board as well. And of course, for an external candidate, what will be critical is that they become more familiar with the community and be integrated into not only the organization but into that community as quickly as possible, so that they can develop an appreciation for the culture as well as the dynamics of the board itself. So, in summary, what are things that we believe you should take away? In essence, you need to define where you are going before you decide who could take you there. That is to say, understand and align your strategy before you pick or begin the process of picking candidates for the role. We think it's important that you force yourself to look at more than one candidate, even if the choice seems obvious, because it will enrich the discussion and debate among trustees, and it will force this process of comparing people to attributes that come out of the strategic alignment and success profile development activity, and rather than being entirely focused on a particular individual. You want to, in your fact-finding about candidates, probe for how they have achieved results as well as what they have achieved, in the sense that you want to understand how well they will fit into this particular organization, and will they be able to create the right climate for success? Are they highly collaborative, for instance? Do they have a very strong independent streak? And will that be a plus or a minus in your organization? Those are the types of considerations that you want to explore when you look at how someone has achieved results. And finally, ensure that you continue to invest in internal talent, because ultimately, if you can create a pool and a pipeline of potential future candidates, this process is one that you can anticipate and that your successors as trustees will very much appreciate, I am sure, as well. So for your discussion, as I conclude this presentation, here are 5 questions for you to consider. How will you gain clarity on your strategy, and how will you then translate that strategy into the requirements for success, the profile of success? Secondly, how will you ensure open and objective debate about both the requirements and the match of your internal candidates to them? In essence, how can you ensure that every trustee has the opportunity to weigh in and provide perspective on this process? Number three, how will you gain greater knowledge of your internal candidates? It's often the case that you will see them in board presentations, but what else can you do? Can you acquire, for example, some assessment data about them? Might you sponsor a 360 review of an internal candidate and ask them to share those results with you so that you get a broader perspective on internal candidates than you likely have today? Number four, how will you know if an external search is desirable or necessary? We've listed several criteria that we think are important, but you may have others or different criteria that will determine for you whether or not this is a step worth your time and expense. And finally, how do you ensure that you allot enough time to do all of this? One observation we have is that certainly starting earlier is better in terms of the transition process from your incumbent CEO, which will often have to do with his or her willingness to share their desired time frame for transition. But it is something that, as we said at the outset, is a task that you and only you can do. So ensure that you afford yourselves the right amount of time and the right level of effort to do it well. In closing, here is some contact information for you, both in terms of your trustee services and myself. I would, of course, welcome any questions or comments that you might have, and thank you very much for your time.